Once again, the theme of Ephesians is unity. Chapter 5, we're focusing on unity with your spouse. Sure, a lot of this doesn't apply to you, you think. However, it sets a basis of your unity with Christ. So, very controversial, Ephesians 5. Get used to it. You plan on getting married in this church. You're going to be examined on this, whether you understand and subscribe to it. In this controversial chapter, Paul gets even more personal than a mere walking with Christ, and more personal than a dwelling with Christ. He now talks about becoming one flesh with Christ. And he is taking that from the Old Testament again. And he probably got that from private revelation as well. So, he presents the basis for that, what he calls a mystery, first. As a basis, he says that you must have a unity with your spouse. A very exclusive unity with your spouse. A submitting of one spouse to each other. Both have to submit. And then he insists that the husband is the head of the wife. Uh-oh. You girls don't like this. Yes, husband is the head of the wife. As controversial as that is these days, that was common sense and common practice in those days. And it's not just Paul who said that. Peter said that. Others say that. Paul, he has already given numerous reasons as to why that is the case, why the man is the head of the wife. So he doesn't stoop to give those reasons again. But as an aid for you, here were the reasons he gave previously. Reasons he gave were, one, man was created first. You go, what kind of a reason is that? Well, because God created him first and created him as head of creation. Number two, woman was created for man. Created to be a helper for man. Number three, woman sinned first and enticed the man to sin. Number four, woman is a weaker vessel. Yeah. Don't argue with that one, or else we got to put everybody on the same hockey team. Woman is a weaker vessel and more prone to being duped, as was the case. And God insisted for that headship to continue for these modern days, to continue due to some intrinsic gender differences. Now let's contrast that for a moment with the reasoning that Muslims give for why man is the head of the woman. Here's the reasoning of the Muslims. This comes from their Quran, their holy book, their Bible of sorts. Here's the reasoning of Muslims. Men have authority over women because God has made the one superior to the other, and because they spend their wealth to maintain them. Good women are obedient. They guard their unseen parts because God has guarded them. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them, forsake them in beds apart, and beat them. How do you like that for reason? Maybe you like the reasoning better than the Bible. Go for it. And from their primary authority, it can be seen that men are superior because men spend money on women and guard them. Men are superior because men can refuse to fertilize the woman. And men are superior because men can beat women up. And that's far weaker reasoning, than the Bible presents to you. Anyways, Paul continues by insisting that wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Everything. Just as the church is to submit to Christ in everything. That's the basis. And that doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room, does it? Except what? Yeah, there's a loophole. Woohoo, a loophole. Yay. Whew. Yes, there's a loophole. A little clause there, not a Santa Claus, a clause there that says, in the Lord. Huh? What's this in the Lord mean? Yes. The in the Lord clause. We see that women were given this wonderful loophole to the Lord in this text, in verse 22. A loophole that grants women a right of refusal of their earthly lord, their husband. It grants women a loophole for disobedience if what is requested is not to the Lord. What does that mean? Yeah, tricky. Examine that one. However, it should be very, very, very clear opposition to the Lord, ladies. Since there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to be liberated by that loophole. Even if it appears your life is on the line. Uh-oh. We'll see that in the next chapter today. So Paul then commands husbands to love their wives. Yes, this is a commandment. This is not a suggestion from Paul. Husbands are to love their wives as they love their own bodies. Ooh, heavy duty. And unlike allegedly 98% of gals, if you've ever seen that commercial, mankind love their own bodies. And Paul repeats this commandment to us guys a little later on, like we didn't get it the first time. He repeats us like we didn't get it the first time, like, duh. Yes. And he rightly repeats it because it is a demanding commandment, very demanding commandment. More demanding than loving your neighbor as yourself. The second commandment. Yeah, more demanding than that? Yeah. It is more demanding because you're not to love your neighbor's wife quite to that extent. However, you do have to love your wife's body whether you like it or not. You do have to feed and care for her just as Christ feeds and cares for his church. Verse 29. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is what Roman Catholics think that it means. Roman Catholics think that that means that feeding and caring is in reference to feeding on the Lord's Supper. Is that all? Just communion? That's all? But they figure that's an actual feeding on Christ's flesh. So they figure that's pretty big feeding and caring. Feeding on Christ's actual flesh when you're doing communion in church at the Mass, the Roman Catholic Mass. However, John Calvin says this is further proof of their indolence and gross ignorance. I think he's right. And Calvin suggests that that mysterious feeding and caring is in reference to a more general feeding of the Word of Christ. And it might be in reference to a general feeding, caring for the congregation in general. But I think Calvin's wrong there. Yes, I think Calvin's wrong. Yeah. I think he's overreaching a bit there. He's spiritualizing things just a wee bit much there. Since that command is not local to the immediate conversation of Paul there. It is very general, and it can apply to your neighbor just as well as your wife. You missed it there, Mr. Calvin. With all due respect. And I think he recognized it. He was speculating there. Now, newer commentaries. The Zondervan has a excellent commentary out, and Wood is an author of that commentary for that particular book of Ephesians, and he says, rather, this feeding and caring is more local to the immediate conversation of Paul. It is more local to the spouse in your house. That feeding and caring is in reference to the very, very close relationship that defines marriage between man and woman. It is in reference to the one flesh relationship of the text, and I shouldn't have to describe that to you. And that's as personal as we will ultimately be with Christ. And that is the profound mystery of verse 32, which is no longer a mystery to you now, or should not be. And that is the grand hope that we are called to, is that tremendous relationship with Christ. Now, Paul concludes this chapter. Final verse says, men are to have a greater love for their wives. Sure, they got some love for their wives, but he encourages them to have a greater love for their wives. And conversely, he encourages women to have a greater respect for their husbands. Oh, that's all good and nice. And to do this in order to have greater unity with your spouse. And in order to have greater unity with him. Remember, that's the basis for your relationship with him. Now you're wondering, well, how about that? Wives don't have to love their husbands, because that's not in the text. You're right, it's not in the text, because Paul said it earlier. He said it in Titus. Ephesians 6. Okay, this is about your unity with your earthly lords. In the very first verse of this chapter, it's probably problematic for all you quizzers. Yep. John Calvin thinks it may be problematic for about 1 in 1,000. May not be problematic for maybe 1 in 1,000 children. And all the rest of you, 999, it's probably problematic for.
Even then.
Yep. He says, obey your parents. Obey your parents? Drag. They're all thinking, drag. Is any of you 1 in the 1,000 that says, oh yeah, goody? No. So, you're told to obey your parents. And that is a command that's unlike that respect command of the previous verse in the previous chapter. Different command. Different word, different command. Respect is internal. Is what you should feel. Whereas obedience is external, it's what you must do. Do. So, you are told to obey your parents, since that is the most tangible indication of your honoring them. Oh, remember that commandment? Ooh. Commandment number 5. You have to honor them. You have to obey them. In everything. But wait, there's a loophole. Yahoo! Goody. We got a loophole. Kids, we got a loophole. Yes. Now, in the last lesson, you were allowed to disobey them if their request is opposed to a clear commandment of the Lord. That good old in the Lord loophole. And in this text, we also have that same old good old in the Lord loophole. You are allowed to disobey your parents if it's not in the Lord. if such an ungodly request that they might ask of you would dishonor them and God. However, you'd better be awfully sure about your loophole. Very, very sure. Because chances are it ain't going to work out for you. I want to bring your attention to a sacrifice in the Old Testament where Abraham was to sacrifice his son. Not something Abraham wanted to do. He called out Isaac, Isaac, I've got to sacrifice you on this altar. Did Isaac go, whoa, wait a minute, that's not in the Lord. There's a loophole here, I can get out of here. Isaac knew better. He was like a teen. And he knew better. He said, I can't get out of this one. This command came from the Lord. He knew it. His father was a holy man. This came from the Lord. I can't disobey it. What happened? What would happen if Isaac disobeyed? We're all thinking, what if Abraham disobeyed this sacrifice? Well, what if Isaac disobeyed too? It would have messed everything right up. I'd hesitate to see what would have happened there. So, even young Isaac was willing to allow his father to sacrifice his life on that altar of loopholes. Now, verse 2. Some people say, okay, well, wait a minute. That second commandment there, it comes with a promise. That also comes with a promise, they say. If you go through the Ten Commandments, some people will, to back up again, some people will dispute that is the only command that comes with a promise. Well, it is. People will argue, no, there's other commands that come with promises too. No, there aren't. They come with curses. There's a very big difference between a curse and a promise. A huge difference. And if you ever get called up for making threats in court, you can't just say to the judge, no, I was making a promise, not a threat. It won't fly. You get stuck in jail regardless. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about slavery a little bit. Other earthly lords. You're going, wait a minute. Paul was really out to lunch on the slavery bit here. However, this is quite unlike our understanding of slavery. Very, very much unlike our present understanding of slavery back then. Back then, 1/3 of the Roman Empire were slaves. That's a whole bunch. 1 in 3 people were slaves in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was huge. It was enormous back then. It covered all of Israel, Palestine, Galatia, Asia. It was enormous. 1/3 of the empire were slaves. So common. And these were not people that were kidnapped from Africa. Didn't happen that way. That's our common perception of slavery. Didn't happen that way back then. Back then, they sold themselves out to be slaves, to pay their outstanding debts. Got to buy a house. I got to get a job. No, I get a loan from the bank. Well, sorry, banks don't exist. You sell yourself out as a slave. You enter into a contract. And these contracts were 6 years long. 7th year, you're free to go. Unless you hadn't paid your debt yet. then you, okay, well, I'll sign up for another 6 years. Pay off my debts. That was slavery back then. I hope that gives you a different idea of Paul's idea of slavery, of the idea of slavery back then. So, Paul says, obey your masters. Obey your earthly lords. So, finally, in Ephesians, we get all this war armor. Now, don't get too obsessive about this war armor. John Calvin says, don't get too obsessive about this war armor, about this helmet of salvation. Yeah, does salvation always have to be a helmet? No, it's not always a helmet. Paul doesn't always call salvation a helmet. All this imagery is irrelevant. He's just trying to provide some helpful metaphors for you. Okay? So don't get hung up on it. Don't take the analogy too far. These are just helpful images. And Paul's final request at the end of Ephesians to these Ephesians he loves so dearly, so very dearly. He stayed there for 3 years, remember? And I'm thinking he probably wrote Romans from Ephesians, from Ephesus. But his final request from Rome to those Ephesians is pray for me. Please pray for me. Use that active sword, that active prayer for me, because I need your prayer, because I'm held up in prison here. I need your prayer. And I imagine those Ephesians did pray for him when they received his letter. So he coveted their prayers, and I believe they gave it to him. And Paul leaves us with one more prayer for us at that point. One more prayer for his Ephesians, a prayer of grace. Yeah, it doesn't get any better than that. Prayer of grace. Okay, and I'll finish with a prayer of grace too. Father, thank you once again for the grace you've given us through this study of Ephesians. Your grace is amazing. You gave us so much grace, and especially the grace that granted us faith to believe in you. We thank you for that faith that you've given us. Amen.